let me know. So the first step on today's agenda was from Jay. You wanted to discuss an update on the status of node level user namespace remapping.
Yeah, we got pinged in our containers roadmap repository about this and whether we were going to implement it. And I mentioned to the original poster that I would ask around and see what the status was on it.
Yeah, so I would say right now that work is on hold. There had been a concerted effort for many months to try to reach agreement and or consensus on an approach, at least even for an alpha style implementation. And Vikas, who you noted in there, was engaged more directly than he is right now on that task. From my perspective right now, that work is on hold. We haven't had engineers come forward and be able to devote a concerted effort to continue to drive it forward. Some of the issues that came up in the actual implementation PR review that we were trying to land for alpha, I think are still unresolved. It might actually be challenging if you looked up Vikas' implementation PR to actually even read that, because I think it had so many comments that the GitHub unicorn appeared.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Frankly, I'd say we might be able to go into more detail on some of the practical experience that we were encountering when trying to test it out that may or may not have been mitigated. I don't know if Mrinal's on the line. We could talk about on the container runtime side, or maybe Seth, you with the details. But we had explored this by trying to do the global user namespace remapping support. You needed the discrete runtimes to actually support it. I think a good faith effort has been done on the cryo side to try to measure the overall impact. And I think when we last measured this, it had significant costs on pod startup time. That it still was felt that there were changes that were desired on the lower end of the Linux kernel to make it really tractable or usable in production. It could be that information is now out of date and we'd have to go back and remeasure. But right now, we just haven't had people in the community helping push this further along since probably last KubeCon.
All right. Is that something that where you're looking for someone to take over the work from Vikas's PR, or did your team essentially run into enough of a sort of reality roadblock that pull requests implementation is seen as just not viable?
Speaking from the Red Hat side right now, we hit enough reality roadblock implementation standpoints that it wasn't deemed worth our present time investment to overcome those humps, given other relative priorities. If on your side you had engineering cycles spared to offer to help overcome those hurdles, that would probably be well appreciated. My memory's a little fuzzy in particular on this. There were challenges around, if I recall, PSP integration and some backwards incompatibility concerns around introducing this on existing clusters, and generally some lifecycle management concerns on how you'd roll out user namespace remapping in a cluster or not. That still had to be resolved in order to move the design from an alpha to a beta state anyway. So maybe my recommendation would be to, if you haven't already, like the CAP is merged and design document and plans were there. We could go back and revisit what the challenges were, most notably that Jordan had raised when we were doing final code reviews. from my perspective right now, at least on the Red Hat side, we don't have engineering capacity in the near term present release to continue to drive this forward. So,
That's yeah.
and I'm not sure if we have review bandwidth as well, but I don't want to stop anybody from making a good faith effort. The question I would have is like, what was motivating your user to ask about it? And it's worth evaluating if that solution actually fixed that problem or not.
Or whether there were, other solutions not involving, user remapping, user ID remapping that would solve the issue.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll try and get some more information on that. I know Gus had, I think, commented on this issue as well. But yeah. Okay. That's really all I wanted, just to see what a status update was on that.
Yeah, I'd love for us to come back and revisit. And like I said, we got pulled off on our own priorities. No one else.
Not a problem at all. I just mainly I just want to make sure that I wasn't going to be stepping on anyone's work and that kind of stuff. So. No,
and Vikas is out of India, so if you did want to reach out to him on Slack and get his perspective, I don't think he can attend today's meeting. I encourage you to do that, and he's always very helpful.
Sure. Thanks.
Okay. The next topic was one that I wanted to raise, but Dawn noted that she fixed the setting. Okay. We were getting complaints that people couldn't contact our mailing lists, and unfortunately only Dawn had the power. So the next topic I wanted to raise, and I don't know if this came up last week, David, so please chime in, or anybody else who was here, was today's the 116 feature freeze. I want to make sure we had our paperwork in place for items that we wanted to track. The main thing I had in my mind was wanting to make sure that we can get the next topic unblocked, which was the topology manager capabilities. So, but I was not aware of necessarily anyone else's work at this point was improperly labeled or needing anything reviewed today that they wanted to bring out attention for.
The only ones I'm aware of are ones that we've discussed before. I think I see the vertical scaling cap, and there was another one that I think they're hoping to get in, which was had to do with using the node lease as a if the kubelet can't acquire its lease to not run pods. Let me see if I can find that, but I don't see it on our agenda, and I don't think they've come and talked to us.
That was the storage related cap, right? The node shutdown taint?
Yeah, node shutdown taint one is requires someone from SIG Node definitely to sign off, but I don't know what the status of that is and if they're still trying to get into 116.
Okay. All right, with that in mind, I guess if there's no other ones that people wanted to raise now, we can continue to iterate on the designs that we'll need to work on for the long run. Just from the code standpoint, I guess, Kevin, we can talk through the next topic. I do want to make sure that your item is properly labeled for 116. I know we made the best effort to get it in 115, but I don't see a reason why we should be blocked on it now in 116. So do you want to talk through the topology manager device?
Sure. So before I do that, I guess, what all needs to be done for, you say, labeling of it? I know we're in that spreadsheet that they sent around, asking to make sure that we were included, at least from the KEP perspective. Is there anything more that needs to be done?
Tradition has been the KEP needed to be labeled appropriately. I don't think we even went back, since this didn't fully land in 115, to update it to say 116, but we can do that if you think the KEP is out of date. Like, hit me up on Slack and we can get that in today, because there's no change in approach. And then the enhancements issue, I think, still needs to be labeled 116 if it's not, and those would be the two things.
Okay. Okay, and these are, when you say labels, these are GitHub labels, or?
Yeah, so I can go take a look now real quick.
But yeah, other than that, the two PRs that I have listed here, these are ones that have been pending for quite a while, mostly because they are blocked on someone in package kubelet or command kubelet approving them. They've been approved at the CM level, but not higher up. And until they get approved up above, obviously we can't merge them. And then we have a series of maybe 4 or 5 other PRs that all depend on these, which we can't move forward with because they require rebasing on top of these once they've merged.
Yeah. So admittedly, since we tried to land this in 115, I deferred review cycle on it right now, given that I knew we had time in 116. So I'm happy to continue to unblock that, and we'll review the PRs this week.
Yeah, I think once these two have merged, we have Connor Doyle who's dedicated to getting this in, and he is an approver for at least at the CM level. So,
yep.
Once these two are there, we should be in pretty good shape for being able to move a lot faster with the other ones. So,
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So thanks for calling out attention to those, and I'll promise you that I'll take a look at them this week.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
And as I said, I desperately want to be able to get you guys unblock this release. Topics you wanted to raise relative to this, Kevin?
No, I don't think so. Everything else is pretty, isolated down. Nothing that needs to be discussed in this meeting, I don't think.
Okay. So the next topic was the vertical scaling cap. Is Vinay here that wants to talk through this more?
I don't actually see him on the call, but I know we've wanted to get feedback from you, so I'll see if I can. I know what his proposals are pretty well. So the problem that he's trying to solve right now is that because we just have the spec that says what the desired resources are and the actual sort of state of the C groups and the status, if someone goes ahead and updates the spec for a resize and the kubelet decides that there isn't room on the node, but then restarts, we sort of lose all of that state and can get weird behavior when the kubelet readmits pods. So he's exploring 2 different approaches to try and save that state. One is to save it locally in a file. And the other would be to add a second field to the spec, which essentially represents the resources that the kubelet has admitted. And I think the pros and cons of it are fairly obvious. One requires checkpointing and requires the kubelet to do admission based on the contents of a file on the node. And the other adds a fair amount of complexity to the kubelet just in terms of having to do an update to the pod object each time it admits new resource requests.
Okay. So I was out last week, so I don't know. Do you have a sense on which option was the preferred option, or if we had additional options that maybe David you had thought about?
Well, him and I disagree on this, so
okay.
My preference is not to do the checkpointing, mostly because I think it's going to be hard to get right and very difficult to debug, and it changes a lot of the processes that we currently have in the kubelet.
Yep.
So I don't know if I don't think that's the option I prefer. I'm generally in favor of the adding a second field to the spec to represent the resources that the kubelet has admitted. But I don't think it's fair to him for me to say just this is what I think, and because I know he would much rather not have to go through, say, the additional API review for the field. I think he preference is to keep it simpler from an API standpoint.
This is Vinay. Hi. Sorry, I just joined, was running a little late. So I missed a part of the discussion. I guess this was one of the first ones that got picked up. I added a link that is, it doesn't really matter that much whether we, from the correctness standpoint, it doesn't matter whether we put it in the spec or we do a node local store. So I started with the node local store of source of truth and tried to play out how things would work. And I put something this morning. Sorry, I've been very busy. I couldn't do this earlier so that could have more time to look at it. I guess if you get a chance this week, we'll look at this, and I'll also add how it would work with multiple pods. I still have to work through that. Now, whether it's node locally stored or whether we do an update, a pod update to update a field in the spec via sub-resource, the effect as far as the correctness should be the same. I think the goal we're trying to hit is in case of kubelet restart at various points of time, we should be able to recover and get back to where we were before the restart hit.
Okay. So, Vinay, I don't know when you joined, but I was saying I've been away for the past week and have been a bit underwater trying to catch up on things since I've been gone. So I haven't had a chance to review this material yet either. I think David was basically trying to summarize the two approaches outlined on checkpointing versus changing the pod spec.
Right.
And I guess if that's clarified in the document, I guess changing the pod spec is it only at admission time that you have to change this, or do you have to change the pod spec of every other pod on that host at admission time?
It's only at admission time. The way I look at it, if it's a pod spec change, the two approaches are one is node local store of the source of truth, the other is putting it in the pod spec. So if it's a new pod, then at admission it should have the same what is admitted. So you can safely put the resources and resources allocated to be the same value. The pod gets either admitted or rejected. And the question is, upon update, let's say a resize request comes in, then the handle pod update is the one that is triggered. And during that, we have two things to consider. One is the requests and the limits. For the requests, you do the summation of all the pod resources that's in use and check against the capacity, allocatable capacity of the node. And you can determine whether you can allow it or not. And if you decide to allow it, then you set either you put a node local atomic file right, or you up to a pod update and optionally the pod condition as well. And if the kubelet were to restart at that point, we can pick it up during the handle pod additions. All the pods come back to you upon restart. And once all the pods are received, you know where things are if the restart happened after you updated. If it happened before, then we're back to as if it was a pod that was requesting. We see that the desired is different from what is currently there, and we act on it as if it's a new update request. So this is the scenario. I worked through it for a single pod case, single pod scenario with multiple cases where different times when the restart happens. And now the next step for me is to look at 2 pods or more and see that it should work, because since we handle pod in a serial fashion, the last pod that was in the process of being updated is the one that we have to consider. But then we also want to see that, if 2 updates are in progress, if that ever is a scenario, that's the one that I have to work through. I don't think it would be, but with the limits, it could take some time, especially lowering memory. If we checkpointed it, I believe that resolves the problem. So I'm going to do that update, work through the scenario for 2+ pods, and then update the comment that I have in the link that I've given below. I'll add to that response. I haven't updated the document yet because I want to kind of get a handle on which way to go before I make a document update. Whether we choose the spec or whether we choose the node local store. The reason node local store seems simpler is, of course, you don't have to do the API change, and you're not writing back. If you're not using pod condition, you don't have any traffic back to the API server at all for an accept, and you're doing everything locally. And it is just an extension of what we do today, where we come back up after restart and we discover what pods are currently running, and then we get all the list of pods that the API server desires us to be running, and then we bring that current state equal to the desired state. And resources is just an extension of that.
Okay. So I'm going to need some time, Vinay, to catch up on this.
Of course.
I'm wondering if anybody else on the call has opinions on this. I think node checkpointing has been a source of pain for us. And just so that it's not just David and myself talking on the call, I'm curious if anybody else has had a chance to review this or evaluate it from their perspective. If not, they're probably in a similar situation. So, Patrick, on the Windows side, did we ever actually discuss what limitations exist or don't exist with respect to resizing pods?
Yeah, I put some comments in there previously around the vertical auto scaling. Basically, the biggest wrinkle here is that we're still rolling out the Hyper-V runtime, and I don't have a ETA on when I'd be able to implement this, because the stuff for Hyper-V is going to be late this year, and then we'll be able to look at things like adding memory later once that's done.
Patrick, from the implementation perspective, yes, I tried Windows, and currently it does not support just with the Docker update command, it doesn't support that. I believe that's the implementation side on the CRI receiver end, the CRI server end.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe you had comments regarding the CRI itself currently presenting Linux container resources, and I noted that in the kept thing. Okay, it has to be modified so that it works for Windows as well. The paths, the C group paths that get passed for Linux container resources is not what Windows uses, so it has to be translated.
Yes. Yeah, and so we'd have to remove, you're right, we'd have to remove the C group implementation detail there and plumb it through CRI to implement this. So. Right,
so I'm not completely sure what the Windows implementation is, but there might be some work on the caller end, CRI caller end, before it calls the update container resources. I'm looking to you to help me with that.
Okay. Unfortunately, I can't put any time on this. Probably for the next 6 months.
That's fine. I think we discussed that this is not necessarily a blocker for the KEP itself, the implementation for Windows, and I'm sure there are other CRIs out there. There was a question regarding Wordlet also. One of the Wordlet maintainers or owners mentioned that it might not readily work for that. I have verified this for, of course, the vanilla Docker and then Kata. They both work.
Yeah, I guess kind of my biggest caution here is that the more we add features to Kubernetes that depend on modifying C groups directly without adding CRI support for those instead, then the more expensive it's going to get to resolve these deltas.
We actually don't modify the container C group limits directly. We pass the information to through the CRI. We say, okay, this is the memory limit, memory dot limit in bytes, and then CPU, CFS share those parameters. And that's just the information that you would get on the Windows side as well. I would assume that's sufficient. If it's not, then that's where I would need some help on what needs to change on the caller end. The things that get passed is probably the CRI paths. That's not going to make sense. I don't know how today, when it is created, how it is. I know Windows has a separate structure for create, but not for update. So there was a discrepancy there, which we need to resolve.
Okay. So you're saying update's not supported in Docker shim implementation of CRI, right?
Not currently, not for Windows.
Okay. Go ahead and open a bug and assign it to me on that, and then I'll see if I can get somebody that's working on Containerd to look at that and see if it's something that could be implemented or not.
Awesome. Yeah, great. I'll do that today.
All right. Thanks.
So I guess on this issue, and I apologize, we're going to have to let everyone get up to speed on the latest discussion. And David, I appreciate you sharing your perspective, and I'll try to form my own. And we probably would want Dawn to weigh in as well.
Sounds good.
Let's try to pick this up again next week, but obviously through the release, we can keep iterating on the KEP until we're all happy.
Sure.
The last topic on today's agenda was, I guess, drawing attention to just integration tests. So, Lee, I've gone ahead and approved that. I think it makes sense. I don't think we need a lot of discussion on that here, unless there was something particular you want to call out.
Nope, that's it. Thanks for doing that.
All right, thank you. I think that went through today's agenda topics. Are there other things not noted that people wanted to raise today? Otherwise, are we comfortable deferring to next week in the discussion?
I had some questions around privileged, but it might be quite a bit of a rat hole. But if there was nothing else, I'd be curious to kind of soundboard and see if anybody else has opinions on. I think there's discussion on removing privileged, but there's some aspects of privileged which is good, and some of them which are really terrible. This is less at the kubelet level, but it would be specific, for both, for all the different CRI implementations, which consume the privileged flag. So I wasn't sure if has been discussion at all on this lately, or if it makes sense, or if we should just talk about VI versus Emacs instead.
It's probably best if you could maybe provide a pointer to any existing discussion that we could level up on before rat holing on it now. I think removing privilege concerns me given its widespread use.
I agree. Yeah, I'm not looking at that. It's more that how privilege is interpreted depending on the runtime class or depending on the actual OCI runtime running underneath. I think that it should be different. Passing host devices, for example, doesn't make sense. But some of the other stuff that you can't specify in a container spec, like read-write access to the kernel's file system, things like this, would be positive still. So, I have some issues open on Containerd and starting to talk to Mrinal about that to see, but wasn't sure if it made sense to discuss at the node level or not.
Okay. From my perspective, I think across the runtimes, we should probably have the discussion. And if there's a doc that captures maybe any output you've had from the existing Containerd community or the cryo community or any other runtime community, let's get that recorded and talk through it. But I don't know if we'll have a great conversation today. Okay. So I guess the key action item here is Kevin, I'll take a look at your PRs this week, and then if we can chat on Slack to just make sure that the paperwork is in order for your feature, we'll get that done today. Otherwise,
actually, this is Tim Allclair. I had a topic from last week that we didn't get to. So if we have time to do that now.
Okay.
That was the seccomp to GA. Sorry I didn't add it to the agenda earlier. I meant to do that. There we go. So yeah, I opened a KEP for this proposal. Most of the KEP is going into details of how we deal with the API itself and translating between annotations and fields, which is a bit of a mess. But the main thing I was interested in discussing here is whether people are supportive of the idea of seccomp going to GA more or less in its current state with its current functionality. It's sort of been stuck in this kind of awkward pseudo-alpha state for a long time. Partly because no one has just been able to prioritize it. And so the idea of this proposal was to say, we have all these ideas of features we'd like to add and improvements we'd like to make, but those could all be iterative on top of the current functionality. And do we need to block kind of cleaning up the API and marking this as sort of a first-class thing on those other enhancements that we want to make? And so this is trying to suss out like what is the MVP to get this feature to GA to promote the annotations to fields, and then can we sort of follow up with everything else later? So are there any thoughts on that idea?
Hey, Mrunal here. So in general, I think we want to move to enabling seccomp, but to be honest, I haven't looked at the current state. And I'm happy to review where things are at and give more feedback.
Yeah, thanks. Take a look at the KEP. Sorry, I missed the first thing that you said. You want to what?
Yeah, we want to enable seccomp, and we want to, yeah.
Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest sticking points for me was that I'm still hoping that someday we can turn this on by default. But because of the sort of pseudo-alpha state that seccomp is in, and because turning it on by default is a backwards break incompatible change, I don't really think that moving the feature to GA actually changes anything in our ability. I don't think it makes it harder or easier to enable it by default. Actually, it probably makes it easier. I don't think that's something that needs to happen before it goes to GA.
Yeah, so at a high level, Tim, I agree on the value of promoting this out of a limbo annotation alpha state. In the spirit of moving things forward that have been in flight to a final end state before taking on new things, I can get behind this 100%. So I guess I haven't had a chance to read your KEP. I'm comfortable if anyone else on the call wanted to pick it up. So Mrunal, if you wanted to take like a first review and give your perspective, that would be great.
Yep. Yeah, I can do that.
Thanks. I guess one other piece of that that's sort of worth raising is, so right now with seccomp, you basically have a choice of 3 options. You can say unconfined, which is the default. That means no restrictions through seccomp. There's runtime default, which is essentially applying the Docker default profile. And then the third one is this thing called where you say localhost and then give a path. And that's a relative path to some predefined root directory on the node. And it expects to find a profile in that path. I was wondering if we actually want to promote that specific behavior to GA, because I think the mechanism is a bit clunky. We don't have any other mechanism to distribute custom profiles. And it also, because of this sort of pseudo alpha state that seccomp is in, I don't know exactly what it would mean to move all of the other functionality to GA without that. But just wondering if anyone's heard of anyone using that localhost feature or has any thoughts on that localhost feature.
Tim, I'm not aware of anybody using the local host feature. I can go double check, but I'm not aware of it being utilized.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, maybe something just to think about for as people are reviewing the proposal. Also, obviously, we're past enhancements freeze, so this is something that I'm looking at for 117 probably.
Okay, today was the date for feature freeze, but if you're doing this for 117, that's even better, I guess. Gives us more time.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Thanks.
Okay. Any other topics then? All right. Well, I guess we can adjourn, and hopefully before next week, I can close these tabs that I opened in today's meeting, hopefully with good reviews and everybody else who took a look as well. So I'll see you all next week. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Derek. Bye.